Hi, welcome to Peg Talk, sponsored by Founded on Truth. I'm your host, Peg Luksik, and in the next 30 minutes or so, we are going to be exploring the issues of the day using a factual approach. There won't be any hyperbole, and whenever possible, I'm going to give you the actual documents so that you can see what I saw when I got the information that I'm about to share with you. And now, without further ado, let us begin. The most important thing in talking about how a government is put together is to recognize that there are fundamental questions that every society has to answer. The very first question is, who's in charge? Throughout history, that's been the push me, pull you between various factions in any society. Now, since we're going to be talking about the roots of America, we're going to start with the Roman Empire because, amazingly enough, that's where that conversation for us began. In the Roman Empire, they believed that the emperor was divine. They were a pantheistic society, meaning they believed in many gods. And since the emperor was a member of the divinity, the authority of the state was unlimited. Whatever the emperor said was the law was the law. So when the Christians came along and said, we are worshiping this Christ person, the original response of the empire was, well, wonderful. The more the merrier. You could put his temple around the corner behind Saturn's temple. It'll fit just fine there. The problem was that the Christians said, no, we're not adding a God. We're saying there's only one. And we're subtracting all the rest. And by the way, that makes the emperor not divine. It means the emperor himself is a man, and therefore the authority of the state has limits. There are things that the emperor should not do and that the government should not do because they'll be wrong. Well, that created a huge problem between the Roman Empire and this new Christian religion. Now, initially, nobody knew exactly what to do with that. And so everybody was sort of tentative about it. The Roman Empire said, well, would you offer sacrifices to the emperor? And the Christians said, no. The Christians said, these laws are immoral, and so we will not follow them. In fact, in ancient Rome, they used to, if an infant was born and the infant had a handicap condition or was a girl and that family didn't want any more girls, they would take those children outside the walls of the city and leave them out there for the wild animals to come and get them. The Christians would go outside the city gates themselves at night and rescue those children and bring them home and adopt it. So it wasn't just that they said the law was different and that they wouldn't follow it. They, in fact, behaved differently and refused to comply with laws that they considered to be immoral. Well, their neighbors began to look at that and say, wait, you live your life differently than we do, and you're happier than we are. That difference began to attract converts. And so Christianity began to grow. Again, the empire didn't exactly know what to do with that whole thing. From their point of view, the Christians were committing treason. The Christians were not accepting unlimited state authority. They were challenging the authority of the emperor. And so originally they began with punishment. We're going to make you pay fines. And they did, but they didn't change their behavior. We may put you in prison for a while. And the Christians went, but they still didn't change their behavior. And as people looked at this faith that the followers were willing to accept punishment rather than renounce it, the faith grew. And the challenge to the empire grew. And eventually it grew to persecution, which led to the lions in the Colosseum. And if you had been a sportscaster at that time, you would have said lions 100, Christians 0, because not one Christian ate one lion. All the lions won those encounters. But it didn't work the way the empire thought it was going to work. Because people again looked at a faith that its followers believed in so strongly that they would die for it and said, there's something real here. There's something different here. There's something that we want here. And that dichotomy continued for about 300, almost 400 years. And in the year 391, the Roman emperor, his name was Theodosius I, he was baptized. And he enacted what were called Theodosian decrees. And he said, Christianity is now the official religion of the Roman Empire, and all of the other religions are outlawed. So the empire was still trying to stay in control. They now just said, well, our control will be called Christianity. The following emperor, Theodosius II, and his co-emperor, Valentina III, put together they took all the laws and they put them in one book. It was called the Codex Theodosianus, which is a big, long name. It was enacted in 438, and it said there's one code of law and everybody has to follow it. So the law was no longer the whim of the emperor. The law was now written down and everybody knew what it was, and it applied to everyone. But the empire really wasn't quite ready to let go. And so by the end of the 400s, as Rome was coming down in power in the empire, and Constantinople, Antioch was gaining in power, the emperor, whose name was Anastasius, wrote to the Pope, who at the time was Pope Gelasius I, and the emperor said, I really like this Christianity thing, but I think that the empire should be completely in charge. And so you should move from Rome to Antioch and basically live under my control. And the Pope wrote back in a very famous letter in 494 AD. And what he said was, there are two spheres of influence. There's moral authority, which belongs to the church, and there's civil authority, which belongs to the state. And he called them swords. And he said the same hand should not hold both swords. That the civil authority of the state can never, ever be more powerful than the moral authority of the church. And that the separation of those powers ensures that the people have recourse and have the ability to protect themselves. That theory, the two-sword theory, dominated Europe. In fact, on Christmas Day in 800 AD, Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. Now, if you've ever seen the musical Pippin, in the musical Pippin, his father was Charlemagne. The musical is pretend. The people in it were real. Charlemagne was a real emperor. He was in France, and at that point, his crowning was a statement to everybody in Christendom that while the emperor was in charge of the state, the people bowed to the emperor was not divine. He bowed to God. That in the end, God's authority was more powerful and more important than the emperor's authority. That was continued in England. In 1100, King Henry I, when he was crowned, signed what was called the Charter of Liberties. Some people called it his coronation charter. And he addressed it to the nobility of England and to the church. And he acknowledged that he had been crowned king by the mercy of God, that the kingdom had unjust practices and that he was going to fix them, and that the church was free of control by the state. Two swords: moral authority, civil authority. And England in 1100, with the crowning of King Henry I, in writing, acknowledged those two swords. That was reiterated in the Magna Carta in 1215. King John was the king. He was kind of a skunk. And the nobles came to him and said, you've really overstepped your bounds. So we need you to put in writing liberties. And so in 1215, John signed the Magna Carta, again, addressing it to the nobles of England and to the bishops of the church, beginning by saying God's authority is the highest, that the Church of England shall be free from the state authority, two swords. It also said no free man shall be imprisoned or exiled or in any way destroyed except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. Those words should sound familiar because they were replayed in an American document. And he would never refuse to grant justice to any subject of England. So the two-sword theory operated throughout Europe from the time it was written in 494, and all of the countries followed it. And sometimes the abuses were on the part of the state, and sometimes the abuses were on the part of the church. But because there were two swords, the people always had the right to appeal one to the other, and it created a balance until we get to Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII, of course, was the very famous king. Little children sing a song about him. Henry VIII had a problem. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, who was from Spain, and she did not give him a son. She had a series of miscarriages and then gave him a daughter, and he wanted a male heir. And so he sought to divorce her, and he went to the Pope and asked for a divorce, and the Pope said no. And so in response, Henry declared that he was the head of the church and the state. And the Act of Supremacy, which was signed by Parliament and then enacted by the King in November of 1534, said that Henry VIII was the only supreme head on earth of the church in England, and that the English crown shall enjoy all honors and authorities and privileges that come with being the head of the church. In effect, Henry grabbed both swords. He remained the King of England. He stayed the final civil authority, and all nobles and officers of the government served at the pleasure of the crown. But he grabbed the sword of the church and said he was now the final moral authority in the kingdom, and that all ecclesiastical leaders would only serve at the pleasure of the crown. Now, when Henry died, he did in fact have a son eventually who lived for a very short time, and then we had Queen Mary, and then the crown passed to Queen Elizabeth, and she passed what were called the Uniformity Acts, which furthered the process of giving the crown control of the religious practices in England. And in 1559, the Uniformity Act said that not only was she the final moral authority, but that all religious practices had to be approved by the crown, and that any vicar or priest or pastor who did not abide, the first time they would be imprisoned for 6 months, the second time they would be imprisoned for a year, and the third time they would be put in prison for life without bail. So when the Queen said she was in charge of both swords, she actually meant it. She also initiated in 1559 an oath of supremacy, in which anyone who wanted a role in the government had to testify and declare in their conscience that the Queen is the only supreme governor, and in all spiritual and ecclesiastical things or causes, as well as temporal. So anyone who wanted to serve in the government would have to swear that they agreed that the crown had both swords. Elizabeth died without any heirs. The crown passed to King James I, who was her cousin. When he came to power, he came in front of Parliament in 1609, and in a series of speeches said, "Kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself, they are called gods. To the king is due both the affection of the soul and the service of the body of his subjects." He said, "It is sedition in subjects to dispute what a king may do in the height of his power." He said he told his subjects to beware, to exhibit for grievance anything that is established by settled law, for it is undutiful on the part of subjects to press their king when they know beforehand that he will refuse them. That philosophy explains a lot about why King George, 150, 60 years later, behaved the way he did when the American colonists began to press upon the king. In England, that was considered undutiful. Because the two-sword theory had been operating in Europe for all of this time, the king needed a new theology to support this grabbing of power by the crown of England. So he asked Sir Robert Filmer, who was his court theologian, to write a book that could talk about and explain to the subjects of England and hopefully Europe that what was now called the divine right of kings, this whole idea that reasserting basically the Roman emperor's position that the authority of the king was unlimited, and as King James said, even that king sit upon God's throne. The result was a book called Patriarcha, or The Natural Power of Kings Defended Against the Unnatural Liberty of the People. It was published in 1630. In the book, Robert Filmer started by identifying his opponents and then spending the rest of the book refuting what the opponents of that philosophy would say. It was a very common way to do argumentation in the Middle Ages, and so he was following basically the same formula everyone else did. So in chapter 1, Robert Bellarmine said, "I come now to examine the argument which is used by Bellarmine, and is the one and only argument I can find produced by any author for the proof of the natural liberty of the people. It is thus framed. That God has given or ordained power is evident by Scripture, but God has given it to no particular man, because by nature all men are equal. Therefore, God has given power to the people or the multitude." Well, who was Bellarmine that Robert Filmer decided he needed to refute? Bellarmine was actually a cardinal. He lived in France. His name was Robert Bellarmine. And he wrote a document, it was a treatise, it was called De Leches, which is a treatise on civil government. And in De Leches, Bellarmine said, "All men are born naturally free and equal. Mankind is endowed and born with freedom from all subjection and at liberty to choose what form of government it please. The people themselves immediately and directly hold political power, so long as they have not transferred this power to a king or a ruler. For legitimate reasons, the people can change the government to an aristocracy or a democracy or vice versa. It depends upon the consent of men to place over themselves a king or a council or a magistrate. The people never transfer its power to a king so completely, but that it reserves the right to receive back the power." Those words should sound very familiar, because every American is intimately familiar with the equivalent of those words that were signed in 1776. On the screen, you are seeing the two sets of words side by side. All men created equal, endowed by their Creator with rights. Governments get their power from the consent of the governed, and whenever a government is destructive, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. Thomas Jefferson had a copy of Patriarcha in his library. It is now in the Library of Congress. We know he read it. His handwritten notes are all over the document. So we absolutely know that Mr. Jefferson was very familiar with the writings of Cardinal Bellarmine. Well, how does that translate into America? From the very beginning of this nation, Americans began to challenge the idea that there were no limits on the authority of the state. William Bradford of Massachusetts, William Penn of Pennsylvania, Cecil Calvert of Maryland, Roger Williams of Rhode Island, all said, in the area of faith, limits exist. In fact, Pastor Jonathan Mayhew, in January of 1750, which was the 100th anniversary of the beheading of King Charles, issued a sermon. It was called A Discourse Concerning Unlimited Submission and Non-Resistance to the Higher Powers. And he said, "No civil rulers are to be obeyed when they enjoin things that are inconsistent with the command of God. Disobedience to them is a duty, not a crime. No government," he said, "is to be submitted to at the expense of that which is the sole end of all government, the common good and safety of society." Pastor Mayhew's sermon was actually printed in the Boston paper in its totality, and it was sent to England and printed in London. John Adams called this sermon the opening shot of the American Revolution. So in the area of justice, America said, limits exist. What about in the area of taxation, property rights, our money? John Dickinson was a Pennsylvania lawyer. He put together a series of letters that were published in the Boston Chronicle. In the very first one, which was published in December of 1767, he was talking about the British Parliament that had passed an act to say that Americans had to keep British troops in their homes and provide for everything that the British troops wanted at their own expense. And so Mr. Dickinson, in his Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, published in the Boston Chronicle, said if a British Parliament has the legal authority to do this, then they have the authority to lay any burdens on us that they please. And that can't be right. He was his sentiments were also stated by a very famous man named Patrick Henry, who in Virginia, in the resolves on the Stamp Act, Mr. Henry stood up in the Virginia legislature and said, the House of Commons in England have drawn into question how far the assembly of this colony, Virginia, has the power to enact taxes. And his response was that the assembly of this colony, together with His Majesty, have in their representative capacity the only right to levy taxes and impositions on the inhabitants of the colony. Because the Americans didn't have any representatives in the Parliament in England. The famous line is taxation without representation is tyranny. The word tyranny, by definition, means that the government has stepped beyond its limits. That can only happen if there are limits on the authority of the government. And in the area of taxation, once again, America said limits exist. England said they didn't exist. And eventually, this led to a situation in which there was no resolution other than the words of Richard Henry Lee, uttered in the First Continental Congress on June the 7th of 1776. And his words were, resolved, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. That resolution led to the creation of the most famous document, not only in American history, but in the history of Western civilization. And in our next section, we will talk about it. I thank you so much for joining us today. And I did want to invite you to take a look at our website, Founded on Truth, where you will not only see this video and others like it, but some of the resources that we have made available to you. Some of them are books that I have written. There's one on a parent's guide to selecting a reading curriculum, which I thought everyone might enjoy. And then there's a book called Love Mom, which is not political. It's just to reconnect each of us with the joy and wonder of being a parent in today's society. There really is no such thing as just a mom. Parenthood is one of the highest virtues that God can possibly give us, allowing us to share in procreation with Him. And so Love Mom hopefully will help to reconnect you. I invite you to take advantage of those, and I look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, may the good Lord hold you in the palm of His hand.